I feel especially badly for parents who are not Christians because they have no alternative perspective. You know, a Christian at least has some alternative perspective.
Only Christians have an alternative perspective. Not even the other major religions that share a lot of your religious texts. Hello lovely people, my name is Emma. Welcome to my channel, welcome back if you have been here before. Today we are going to continue with the latest episode of the Girl Defined podcast, what homosexuality, transgenderism, and abortion have in common with Professor Nancy Pearcey. Because we're carrying on part way through, I would say it's probably better if you haven't seen the previous video to go back and check that out first. As before, content warning, it's bigoted, it's homophobic, it's transphobic, it's anti-abortion. You know the drill. One thing that some people pointed out to me that I didn't realise in the last video is that Nancy Pearcey is a fellow of the Discovery Institute. The Discovery Institute is a think tank, a Christian conservative think tank. I don't know if anti-science is fair, but certainly undermines science. They are anti-evolution, they are anti-teaching, evolution, education. They do genuinely believe Adam and Eve really exist. So this does actually answer a lot of my questions that I had last time for Professor Pearcey, because I had a lot of questions around the topic of how does evolution fit into this discussion. It doesn't make any sense. But if she is a member of the Discovery, if she's a fellow of the Discovery Institute and she believes Adam and Eve were real and believes in creationism and the possibility that the Earth is 10,000 years old, it would explain a lot for a professor of apologetics to be anti-evolution, which I said this last time, it is fact. And before anyone jumps in with a comment about how it's just a theory, please look up what a scientific theory is before you comment it, because it just makes you look silly. So frustrated with people conflating theory with hypothesis. Evolution and natural selection are real, they are fact. With that in mind, I go back into this discussion with a slightly different frame of mind. I mean, after listening to the first 20 minutes, I already have a lower opinion, to be honest, of the people involved in this podcast because of the way that they are conducting this interview is very poor. So we're just going to get back into it with this new knowledge that they are, yes, most likely creationists and anti-evolution and more or less anti-science. And oh my god, I am so sorry for part of my microphone stand being in the front of that video. When I started editing it, I was so annoyed with myself because it is just there front and centre the entire time. I am aware of it. I have doubly made sure that's not happening this time. This is my pop filter. That can't be helped. That's in most of the videos. So I'm very sorry. I know it's annoying. It annoyed me too, if that makes anything any better.
There was a young man named Sean who had been exclusively same-sex attracted from the time he was quite young. And the interesting thing about his story is that he grew up in a gay-affirming family and attended a gay-affirming church.
A gay-affirming family? That's the new definition? You would never say you're in a straight-affirming family. What bizarre language.
So again, his change was not driven by shame or guilt either. By the way, he's now married and to a woman and has 3 kids.
Wow.
And is an ethics professor, a Christian ethics professor in London. But here's how he explained his turnaround. He said, I stopped taking my identity from my sexual feelings and started taking my identity. He says, I didn't try to change my feelings, because that doesn't usually work.
Yeah.
But I started taking my identity from my body, because your feelings can change, but your body, he said, here's how he put it. I accepted my body as a good gift from God.
Wow.
And then my feelings started to follow suit. And so,
if I was born with no arms, is the assumption that I should never learn to write because that was clearly God's gift to me, was to never write anything? I should never learn to write, using my mouth or whatever, because God clearly doesn't want me to write. It's preposterous. There is nothing, if I looked at my body, and I did this last time as well, if I looked at my body, there is nothing here that says, don't sleep with women. I'm not seeing that anywhere. In my experience, so much of the Christian kind of doctrine and explanations is based on feelings. They talk about how you feel it when it's real. You feel it, the Holy Spirit. How do you identify which feelings are God-given good feelings and which feelings are just your silly feelings you should ignore in favor of your body?
That's really the worldview question that's at the heart of this debate. Do we live in a cosmos operating by blind material forces, in which case your body has no intrinsic purpose or dignity,
Yes.
and you can do with it whatever you want?
Yeah.
Or do we live in a
Yes.
universe, a cosmos designed by a loving creator,
No.
and therefore our body is a good gift? Creation is...
I think she's oversimplifying a lot there, because we could live in a universe designed by a creator, but still, the process from the start of the universe, kicking it all off and, having matter interact and the universe expand into something which in some tiny places can sustain life, is so far away from humans developing the bodies that we have now. If you won't factor evolution into your argument, you shouldn't use designer of the universe as part of your argument either, because the two of them don't... How do you can't correlate those two. Why did he design so much millions and billions of fascinating distant stars, some of which have their own planets, many of which don't, all of them so far away as to have no impact on humanity's lives for the whole length of our existence as a species? Why did he make those? If he designed everything such that I exist right now exactly how he wanted me to be, then he also made an asteroid billions of light years away. But why?
It has an intrinsic purpose, and the goal is to live in harmony with that purpose.
Wow. So many good things there. The number one thing that comes to my mind is what I'm often told myself, especially on social media, direct messages I'll get. And it's typically from people saying, well, if God is loving, then, he would accept and approve of this lifestyle, because he wouldn't make me, a girl on the inside and a boy on the outside just to say that's not possible, So what do you say to the person?
Exactly.
I know this fits in right with everything you just said, but what do you say to maybe the young woman who's listening, who's saying, well, my body, it is a girl, but on the inside, I'm a boy, and a loving God wouldn't do this, so it's okay for me to...
An all-loving God. That's important. That is important, is that they claim their God to be an all-loving God. So God is supposed to love you whatever you do, despite all of the rules and regulations and, all of the people he murdered in the Bible.
Change my body to reflect the inside. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I hear it all the time. Let me answer again with a story, because, stories work so well.
Yes.
Stories work so much better when you don't have a straight answer.
In
get
My
it.
Body, I tell the story of a young boy named Brandon, who had gender dysphoria from a very young age. So what did his parents do? They made sure he knew they loved him just the way he was. I have had, when I was in seminary, I had a friend who was a former homosexual, and he said when I was
A former homosexual. I'm just gonna leave that there. A former homosexual.
young, I liked music and poetry, and my dad was baffled and kept trying to toughen me up.
Yeah.
By pushing me into more masculine things like sports. Well, Brandon's parents didn't do that. What they told him was it's perfectly okay to be a sensitive, gentle, relational boy.
Yeah.
It does not.
So why is so much of this kind of conservative Christianity about promoting masculinity for boys and femininity for girls? I mean, the whole Girl Defined channel is about how to be a godly feminine woman, right? I think she's conflating two issues here. Yes, absolutely. We are on the same page. You shouldn't pressure people to conform to gender norms. I don't know specifically what Nancy Pearcey and Girl Define's positions on this are, other than their general view of how women who are Christians should be. But every other conservative evangelical who I have looked into has very much been boys need to be boys and girls need to be girls. And I think conservative Christianity is really guilty of trying to enforce those gender norms. And if Nancy Pearcey is against that, then that's brilliant and I'm all for it. There's a part of me that is sort of skeptical about the message that they might otherwise preach about being gender non-conforming.
You're really a girl. So that was really important. He never felt like, he was rejected by his parents. And you do not need to live your life by cultural stereotypes. They even took him through history and showed him how concepts of masculinity and femininity have changed over history. And my earlier book, Total Truth, has a chapter on this. And so his parents read, it's chapter 12. Brandon's parents read chapter 12 with him and said, look, you do not have to live according to current stereotypes. They change. They're historically contingent. You find out.
So why do you have to live by historically contingent biblical stereotypes? Interestingly, she looked back through history. I bet she didn't look back through any of the history of trans identities like we discussed last time.
And you live that way, and you don't worry about whether it fits the masculine stereotypes. Or if it was girl, I would say, don't worry if it doesn't fit the gifts of the Spirit for women. No, prophecy and teaching are not masculine, as you and I might expect. And mercy and service are not feminine. It says that this was true gender dysphoria. And he's way over.
Yeah.
I don't feel like we've answered the question of wouldn't an all-loving God love you and your body anyway, however you chose to identify. This is also a very old school conservative thought process that I've seen quite a lot, where they think trans person, they think surgery. There's no nuance. There's no people who just use different pronouns, who identify differently. It's very much like, oh, if you're trans, then you have top and bottom surgery. That's how they view it. I totally don't feel like we've answered the question that Bethany actually asked a decent question, and we told a story about a boy who was struggling with being gender non-conforming, but I don't see anywhere in which we've really answered the question.
The emotional, gentle side, but he is a boy. And he's accepted that. And he's accepted that it is more loving to help somebody accept who God made them in terms of their biology, in terms of their body. Your feelings change and often do. There are lots and lots, growing numbers of detransitioners today. People who feel like they were misled, people who feel like they're detransitioning, like the girl I told you about who was identified as a boy at age 11. And
so detransitioning is another argument. I've actually had this conversation before while discussing J.K. Rowling and her sort of fear of the trans community. Detransition is something that these kind of conservative transphobic type likes to use a lot, as though it is like most people are detransitioning. And first of all, detransitioning is more common in the very early stages of transitioning, usually way before any surgeries take place. As always, sources will be in the description. It's estimated that the number of detransitioners range from less than 1% to as many as 5%. But they will always talk about people detransitioning, and they will never ever say what proportion of people that is. So I'm here to tell you that it's between less than 1% and 5% of people, estimated. But they use it as a powerful argument as if 95+% of people aren't benefited by transitioning. It's a scare tactic.
And there's a Supreme Court case in England. They call their Supreme Court the High Court. So the High Court in England just adjudicated a case where a young woman, she's 23 years old, not uncommon. You get a 30-minute visit and the gender clinic says, congratulations, you're really a boy. And here's where you get testosterone. And she now says, she took this case to court and she said, they did not probe any of my psychological issues. I definitely had psychological issues that needed to be addressed. There was a study done maybe a year ago at Brown University, which found that young girls, and this was specifically girls, but the point is that these young girls were so distressed that they had already, now, your demographic, that teenagers often have some anxiety and depression.
Yes.
But these were girls where it was severe enough that their parents had actually taken them to a psychologist and had it diagnosed before the onset of their gender dysphoria. So the thing to keep in mind is these are very troubled girls. And that's something we need to keep in mind.
So I'm guessing that's finally the end of her point. It's really hard to tell. That was insanely rambling, kept veering off in weird directions. That was like me streaming, was Professor Pearcey trying to finish that thought. I keep returning to this with conservatives. I was talking about this today on the topic of abortion, where it's like campaigning that something is bad is one thing, but if you find like that there's a root cause of something that worries you, like say people eventually detransitioning because they actually needed better support with their mental health, you shouldn't be talking about how being trans is bad, because the 95+% of trans people who don't detransition and are happy having transitioned, first of all there's that, you're talking about a very small minority, but second of all, you should be campaigning for better mental health support for young people. And then we can agree on that, and we can work together and actually make a difference. Better access to mental health support, well, for everyone really, but especially, yes, for young people in this transitional period of their life. Better mental health support. Destroy gender norms. If they want to make a difference, based on what they have been discussing in this podcast, they should be working on taking down gender norms. Girl Define's entire channel is about reinforcing stereotypical gender norms. But Bethany will sit there going, wow. And this is, I think, a actually sensible discussion to have. Again, they're talking about the minority and acting like it's the majority. Those are fear tactics again. I disagree with that way of discussing just being trans in general. But if they're talking about this particular issue and saying that part of the problem is that the young people didn't get the mental health support that they needed, that is what you should be campaigning to change. And Professor Pearcey talked about this quite early on as well. A lot of the problem with the way the church discusses these issues is the negativity that they put forth. Well, I say, why isn't Professor Pearcey campaigning for positive changes to access to mental health support in education? You know, like that would support her argument and help the cause. I think the fact that they are not campaigning to improve these services that would genuinely help shows that their concern probably isn't the young people who are being hurt. Their concern is trans people, you know?
So why do you think, Nancy, that so many, genuinely loving parents, just people who they're like, okay, I'm not trying to be extreme, but are just going full, like, head on with this whole movement is kind of what I want to call it, where it's just like, yes, this is, especially the extreme of altering your body and making permanent lifelong decisions.
Again, she's asking about the extreme, most of the conversations around being trans between parents and children will be like using their preferred pronouns. But no, it's all the crazy extremes that we must talk about, because that makes it much easier to have our position of being against them.
Why are, loving parents and even, loving teachers or loving doctors, why are they just so 100% on board with this whole movement?
It's almost as if loving parents and loving teachers and loving doctors might be better qualified than Nancy Pearcey and Bethany from Girl Defined on this topic.
I feel especially badly for parents who are not Christians, because they have no alternative perspective. A Christian at least has some alternative perspective to look at a cultural message and say, is this true or isn't it?
Only Christians have an alternative perspective. Not even the other major religions that share a lot of your religious texts. Only Christians.
And so Christians do have a bit of a protection that way. Many of the parents I talked to for this article, they weren't Christian. So they do nothing except what the culture was telling them.
There is only what the culture is telling you and the Bible. Those are the only two options in any discussion. There's the dominant social ideology and the Bible. I feel so sorry for people who have taken her classes. Genuinely, I do not believe she could be a good professor, because the way she presents her arguments in this podcast, the interviewer has, like, just let her run free and talk about whatever crazy tangents she wants to, and just sat there going, So, like, she's had free reign to explain her perspective and her arguments as, you know, as detailed as she likes, and they've just been shockingly bad. Shockingly bad. It upsets me that this woman is a professor.
Current human rights issues used to be homosexuality. Now the human rights issue is transgenderism. And so it's to be against transgender, the transgender agenda is to be a transphobe, just like...
Oh, we've moved on from the gay agenda to the transgender agenda, which I will admit is more fun to say.
You know, if you disagreed with the homosexual agenda, you are a homophobe.
Yes. Yes, if you disagree with trans people being allowed to exist, then you are a transphobe. And if you disagree with homosexual people being allowed to exist, then you are a homophobe. She's saying this, like, sort of half laughing, like it's a silly thing, but yes, you are a homophobe. It's not like, oh, that's what the left is called. That's what you are.
You know, if you don't have any alternative sense of truth, you know, an
alternative sense of truth. How Trumpy is that statement? I think calling the Bible an alternative sense of truth is amazing.
How different would it be if I grew up, or at least I were a teen right now, and I was just hearing over and over again almost how it's the better option, and you are even more celebrated.
Nobody is saying it's the better option. You are not more celebrated. Oh my god. Why are these rich, white, cis, straight, evangelical women so desperate to be oppressed? Why are they so people are saying it's better. You get more rewards. You get more gratification if you're gay or you're trans. Fuck off. That is so untrue.
The transgender activists say your identity has nothing to do with your body. They're implying that there's some kind of split between your body and your gender identity, and your gender identity is completely separate. And the same with homosexuality, but it really took root first in the secular world.
I still don't. We've already done this discussion, so I'll just let this sing quickly. I don't understand this relation between your body and your sexuality. It does not make sense to me.
With abortion, the same split between the body and the person is presumed by secular bioethicists. So, you know, this hasn't all filtered down necessarily to ordinary people, but if you read the professional bioethicists, for a long time they've been saying, well, yeah, the fetus is human from the moment of conception. The science, DNA and genetics is just too strong to deny it.
Yeah.
So you do not find any secular bioethicists who deny that life begins at conception. And then
No. Saying something is human is not saying that it's a person. Obviously, a fetus is human. You're not giving birth to a dog, are you?
They'll say, well, biologically, the fetus is human, but it doesn't become a person until sometime later. And a person is usually defined by mental abilities, by what's in your head. You see, it's just like transgenderism, because you're defined by what's in your head, not your body. You see, there's the parallel. But what they say about abortion is you could be human up till some point of development, and then suddenly you jump into this other category called personhood, based on self-awareness, cognitive ability, and so on. Now, of course, the problem is if personhood, if being a person is completely separate from biology, then how do you define it?
Yes.
You know, is it, what level of development do you have to have?
I think this highlights a fundamental difference in scientific thinking and this very black and white literalist biblical thinking, because being secular and being pro-science is largely about being comfortable saying, I don't know. It's being comfortable saying, science doesn't necessarily have an answer for that right now. Maybe we never will. It's very common in these kind of evangelical arguments to be like, well, what's the answer then if it's not God? If not God, then what? And there's no shame in the answer being, we don't know. There doesn't have to be a definitive answer. It's very ingrained. It's very this old school, like, religious thinking that there has to be an answer. That's how you fall into the God of the gaps fallacy, right? There isn't always an answer right now, and that's okay.
And so what you find is that among secular bioethicists, they all disagree. They all draw the line at a different place.
Wow.
So some will say, oh, yeah.
So, you know what? You could say exactly the same thing and replace them with religious people. Religious people disagree. Religious people all draw the lines in different places. Again, if we talk about the video that I just did, classically Abby had an opinion that is radically different to the majority opinion of the religion that she follows. Yes, all people disagree. It says we don't know the answer. That doesn't mean that Nancy Pearcey's Christian view is the correct view, because her view is different, and I know this for a fact because there are nice, rational Christians in my comment sections. Nancy Pearcey's view is radically different from a lot of other Christian views. So to be like, well, science doesn't have they haven't agreed on an answer. Neither have religious people, neither have Christians. It's okay to say we don't know.
Bioethicists now say, well, sure, you're human, but you don't have the rights and moral status of a person until sometime later. And of course, what that means is none of us have human rights anymore. Being human is no longer enough for human rights. You don't get human.
What a farcical, like, scapegoating of the actual position. Like, and what this basically means is people who are pro-choice, they're taking away, we don't even have human rights anymore. It is such a bad faith argument to be like, well, they're just basically stripping away all of human rights, aren't they? Unbelievable.
In fact, let me give you another quote. This was what a high what should I call her? She's a well-known public intellectual, and she's a lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
And she's a bit of...
What should I call her? She's a well-known public intellectual and a lesbian. I guess I'll call her the lesbian. I don't know what I should call her. What? Oh, a person? Does it matter?
An iconoclastic lesbian because she doesn't believe sex is a social construction, which is what a lot of feminists would say. She says, no, nature made us male and female. And so then you say, in that case, how do you defend being a lesbian? And she said, well, yeah, nature made us male and female, but why not defy nature?
Mm-hmm.
That was her word. And then she went on to say, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit.
Hell yeah. Fate, not God, gave us this flesh. We have absolute claim over our bodies. Why not do with them as we see fit? I love that. Thank you, Nancy Pearcey, for introducing me to that quote. It is so much more engaging, and I feel so much more moved by that than anything Professor Pearcey has said in this entire interview. I feel like I don't almost want to call it an interview because it's been such a fucking sham.
So that is really the logic behind the homosexual movement. They're basically saying our bodies are part of nature, but nature is a product of mindless, purposeless forces, and therefore it has no intrinsic purpose.
Yes.
That we are morally obligated to respect.
Absolutely.
Right? So even if nature made us this way, we can do with it whatever we want.
Natural selection and evolution made us this way, but yes.
And what we need to do to counter that as Christians is to say, no, in the Christian worldview, nature exhibits a design, a plan.
It does not. God, what I would give to have a conversation with Professor Pearcey, because nature exhibits so much evidence for an unintelligent design. Like I mentioned earlier, what's the point of the near endless expanse of empty space devoid of life? Why did he create that?
Harmony with that purpose, we will be healthier and happier. This is not just a religious statement. Science itself shows that nature exhibits a purpose. The eyes are made for seeing clearly, and ears are for hearing, fins are for swimming, and wings are for flying.
Yeah.
The
Okay, what about, penguins? Penguins have wings, they're not for flying. This is such an old school, bad argument that has been, I would say, successfully debunked a number of times by people much more intelligent than me and Nancy Pearcey.
Development of the entire organism is driven by an internal blueprint or plan. That's DNA.
No. To call DNA a blueprint is also hugely inaccurate. It's a metaphor that has been taken way too far by people like this, and it is hugely inaccurate. So there's this idea, and I'll find some good sources, I'll put them in the description. There is this idea, especially among people like Professor Pearcey, that DNA is the blueprint for life, that your DNA, I think classically Abby said something similar to this in her abortion video, that DNA is the blueprint to your life is written out in your DNA. It's not true. That is not how genes work. Your DNA provides opportunity. It facilitates your existence, but it's not a code that writes out who you are. There's a good analogy in Scientific American that I'm going to share with you that prefers the metaphor of DNA being like a recipe rather than a blueprint. A blueprint is an exact drawn-to-scale copy of the final product, which is what people like Professor Pearcey are stipulating DNA is when they discuss it being a blueprint. Whereas a recipe is a loose plot that leaves more room to uncertainty. Our DNA contains a list of biochemical ingredients and the basic rules for their assembly, but the pieces self-organize into biochemical pathways, cells and tissues without reading a manual. The genetic recipe for a cat will not give an elephant, but you can't read the DNA of an individual and see a mini-me of his features. And I will share that and some other sources in the description. It frustrates me no end, and we said this in the first part. Jesus, this video is going to be so long. In the first part, we said she is not a biologist. She has no qualifications in that field. Yet she's still making these assertions, and she's making assertions and acting like they're biological fact when she's wrong, when she's playing into this exaggeration, this metaphor that is a layman's misunderstanding of DNA. And I'm a layman too. But if I was going to go on a podcast as a professor, I'm not going to present vague misinformation about biology to back up my arguments. It's really, really bad. So that's not how DNA works. Let's move on. We've not got too long left, thank God.
So science itself shows that we are designed for a purpose.
It does not.
Happier. We are going to be healthier. We're going to have an internal harmony because we're living in harmony with, who even science tells us that this is who we are.
That's amazing. That's so incredibly insightful and interesting.
It's absolutely not. Oh my God, the standard for Girl Defined must be so fucking low. They couldn't even get some Christian scientist to come and have this discussion with them instead of this apologetics professor who is just pulling shit out of her ass.
Girls that are listening, you might be thinking like, wow, I want to understand this more. And that's exactly why Nancy wrote her book, Love Thy Body, which you can dig into more. But before we...
Should I read her book? Somebody sort of lightly challenged me to read her book, and I'm like, I don't, I kind of want to, and I kind of don't know if I can.
For our listeners, they may be thinking, like maybe one of our listeners is thinking like, wow, well, I'm really struggling right now with exactly what you're saying and what Professor Pearcey is talking about. And so what would you say to the Christian girl who's struggling right now with the thought that she may be transgender?
Or homosexual.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or homosexual. Remember, that's a problem too. Yeah.
I answer with one more story.
Absolutely.
No, please.
I tell the story in Lovely Body of a young woman named Rebecca, not her real name, who grew up in a Christian home, dated guys, and never ever thought she would be. It just didn't cross her mind that she would have same-sex attraction. But when she went to college, she met. Almost immediately after she arrived on college, she met a woman who was lesbian, and she fell completely. She totally fell for it. She went home to her dorm that night and said, "This is what I want." So she never totally lived it out, but nonetheless, it was a very difficult temptation for many years, and she fell deeply in love once or twice. And then she got married. She got married and she continued having girl crushes. And so she talked about it with her husband.
Wow.
And he said this. He said, because God made you a woman, you can be confident that no matter what your feelings are right now, you will ultimately be more fulfilled with a man. And of course, it goes the opposite direction too, he said, because
Well, and because this random woman's husband said it, that means it's true. This is just a story about a bisexual woman, a woman with some identity under the bisexual umbrella, telling her husband she has some same-sex attraction. I don't understand why Pearcey was like, and she married a man.
Whatever my feelings might be, I can be totally confident that I will be ultimately more fulfilled with a woman.
Says who? Prove it. You can't just say something and then that makes it true. Although that is Professor Pearcey's entire thing, evidently.
Now that made sense. That's logical.
Mm-hmm.
That's an appeal to the mind.
Yeah.
It's an appeal to the mind that worked. And again, this is just adding to my theory that so much of these conversion stories are just bisexual erasure.
You're not ever fully free, just like an alcoholic probably should never take a drink. I mean, they have to be a lot more careful.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Having same-sex attraction is like being an alcoholic. I should just stay away from women. I should never talk to, never look at a woman because just the temptation might just be too great.
Rebecca said, I still can't watch Orange is the New Black. You know, do you remember Orange is the New Black? It had a lot of lesbian scenes in it.
Yeah,
So she said, you know, I have to be careful. I can't watch lesbian scenes. And there are a lot of movies and commercials now with...
She's bi. This woman is bi, and her religion is pigeonholing her into some sort of weird misunderstanding of her own sexuality. She shouldn't have to avoid TV shows that hint at same-sex attraction. She can be attracted to women and happily married to her husband. That's fine. These people make it such a taboo that she can't even watch TV, and it's probably playing on her way more than it would if it was just accepted.
Like any sin, she has to be careful, but it's not disrupting her life the way it was. So that was, I hadn't, this was years ago, so I hadn't written my book yet. But what her husband was basically saying to her was the same thing as Love Thy Body. He was saying, because biologically God has made you a woman.
Prove it.
You
prove it before you carry on, but okay.
Can be confident that ultimately your feelings will line up.
What about the people whose feelings don't line up? What about the people who have suffered so much in ultra-conservative religious households because their sexuality or gender hasn't been accepted? What about the people whose thoughts magically don't line up? Well, why did God make them not line up in the first place? Why did God make Professor Pearcey the perfect Christian woman from the moment she was born, but cause so many other people to suffer with same-sex attraction?
The story of Rebecca was saying, it was just another way of saying, God has given you a body.
Yeah. Prove it.
You know, God loves you.
Prove
He cares about your body.
Prove it.
He cares about who he's made you to be. And as Christians, it's just amazing.
Didn't he also make the spirit? If he made the body and the spirit, and Professor Pearcey's whole thing is that the body and the spirit are intertwined. If God made me exactly who I am, then he made me same-sex attracted. And God made it so that my physical body responds positively having intimate relationships with members of the same sex. You can't say that God made it one way but not the other.
That we have a higher view of the body than any other worldview out there.
A higher view of the body, a lower view of people. Because I am a Christian, I have the highest view of the body, and therefore I have the right to tell you what you should do with yours.
And at the end of time, God's not going to scrap the material world as if he made a mistake the first time around. We're not designed just to...
Yeah, God never makes mistakes and scraps it. What was the story of Noah again?
To live as spirits in heaven. He's going to create a new heavens and a new earth and restore and renew the physical creation. And you and I will live on that physical creation in resurrected bodies. So from the beginning, the Apostles' Creed has affirmed the resurrection of the body.
Okay, this is getting into crazy town creationism, so I think we're probably done for the day. Wow, that's going to be a lot of editing. That was Professor Pearcey on the Girl Defined show. I've already described how I felt about it. I hated it, but I would love to have a conversation with Professor Pearcey so that I could pose my questions to her, because I would require an answer and an explanation for each point before she used that as evidence for the next point. Essentially, most of her discussions from this were, well, this is correct, and therefore, this is correct. See, because Christianity is true, that proves that I'm right about this thing about homosexuality. And you're like, well, no, hold on, you gotta prove the first bit before that can prove anything else. So, once again, let me know your thoughts. There were some really interesting and intelligent comments on the last video, especially from Christians. I always really like to hear those viewpoints. So do share what you thought with me. Do like this video if you liked it, share it with your friends, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. You can check me out on my gaming channel, you can come and join me on Twitch live 3 times a week, 2 to 3 times a week. And as always, I would like to give a huge thank you to my giant chickens over on Patreon: Amber, ChicFilADeathFries, Connla, Chicken Maximus, Lyons, goddammit Connla, Manny, Miss Bumbriest, Mr. Creosote, Taxman, and Vernon Stubbs. You guys are amazing. I hope that you have a very lovely week, and I will see you very soon.